Her mate abandoned her at the bonding altar. Then the Alpha King took his place. By the time the third ceremonial candle guttered, Aloan hardly understood that the most painful sound in Briar Glen was not laughter. It was the silence of hundreds waiting for a man who had promised to come. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in courage and destiny, hit like and subscribe. These stories remind us, love finds the broken. Now, back to Aloan. She stood alone at the center of the moonstone altar, her hands folded at her waist so no one would see them shake. White stone curved beneath her slippers, polished by generations of bonding rites, while lanterns glowed among the hawthorn trees. Pack elders filled the front rows. Noble families crowded the open court. Beneath the eastern arch, musicians waited with their bows lowered, uncertain whether they were still expected to play. Above them, in the shadowed royal gallery, Alpha King Callum Blackwell watched beside representatives of the crown. Aloan kept her eyes from the vacant place across the altar. Mason Whitlock should have been there. 3 nights ago, they had practiced the opening vow beside the river. Mason had forgotten the second line and laughed, pulling her close when she teased him. If my voice fails tomorrow, he'd said, just look at me. I'll remember why I'm there. Aloan had carried those words through every nervous hour since. Now there was no one to look at. Elder Warren Shaw cleared his throat and glanced toward the carved wooden doors again. The moon has risen, he said. We can allow a few more minutes. A murmur traveled through the gathering. Perhaps he changed his mind. An Omega should have known better. Everett Whitlock will never let his son ruin his future. Aloan focused on the silver bracelet around her wrist. Tiny hawthorn leaves had been etched into the metal by hand, their edges softened by years against her mother's skin and then her own. Her thumb traced one leaf. In the first row, Alpha Everett's gaze followed the movement. Only for a second. Then he looked away. Aloan barely noticed. She was remembering her mother saying promises beneath the moon mattered because darkness revealed what daylight allowed people to hide. She had believed that. She had believed Mason when he said rank meant nothing beside the river. She had believed him when his visits shortened, when his replies became careful, when he stopped meeting her eyes whenever his father entered a room. Breathe, Nora Bellamy whispered from the edge of the platform. Her freckled face was drawn with worry. Beside her, Lydia Hartley stood in her healer's gray cloak, chin lifted. When Aloan touched the bracelet again, Lydia's expression changed, something quick and guarded, before she forced a reassuring smile. He will come, Aloan said. The words tasted more like a plea than certainty. From the royal gallery, Callum studied the court with growing unease. He had witnessed enough political ceremonies to recognize when a room had been prepared for one outcome while pretending to expect another. The idle musicians. Everett's composure. The Crane family seated together in formal silver, their attention fixed not on the doors, but on the altar. Rowan Pierce leaned closer. Should the crown intervene? Callum's steel-blue gaze returned to Aloan. She looked slight beneath the moonlight, chestnut hair resting over one shoulder, pale ceremonial fabric stirring around her ankles. Yet every cruel whisper reached her, and she refused to bow her head. His attention dropped briefly to the hawthorn bracelet. A memory moved at the edge of recognition, incomplete and unwelcome. Not yet, he said. Without proof, royal interference would turn her pain into another spectacle. Still, something beneath his ribs had tightened the moment she entered the court. The same pull he had buried months earlier because she had already made, or seemed to have made, her choice. The final candle bent beneath its melted wax. Elder Warren raised his staff, sorrow deepening the lines around his mouth. Aloan Hartley, if Mason Whitlock does not present himself before the flame dies, this ceremony must be declared. The wooden doors flew open. Every head turned. Mason stood beneath the arch in black ceremonial robes, sandy blonde hair disturbed by the wind. Hope rose through Aloan so fast it almost hurt. She stepped toward him, already hearing his old promise. Just look at me. I'll remember why I'm there. Aloan looked at him. Mason looked everywhere but at her. Then another figure entered behind him. Vivian Crane stepped into the lantern light wearing gleaming silver, and above her heart rested the insignia of a political alliance. For one foolish heartbeat, Aloan told herself Vivian Crane had simply arrived late to witness the bonding. Then she saw Mason touch his collar. It was the small habit he had whenever a truth frightened him, and hope inside her turned cold before either of them spoke. The court shifted around the moonstone altar. Silk brushed against stone benches. A fan snapped shut. Someone near the rear whispered Vivian's name. Eloan heard everything with unnatural clarity. Mason descended from the arch in measured steps, yet his blue eyes moved from Elder Warren to his father, then toward the royal gallery. Anywhere but her. Just look at me. I'll remember why I'm there. Eloan took another step forward. You came. Relief still lived in her voice. She hated that he could hear it. Mason stopped several feet from the altar. We need to speak. Then come here. She glanced toward the place prepared for him. Elder Warren is waiting. His left hand closed at his side. Eloan knew that gesture too. 2 years of loving someone taught you a private language no one warned you could later be used to watch them leave. Eloan, he began. Alpha Everett Whitlock rose from the first row. Say what you came to say, son. Mason flinched. Eloan saw it. So did Callum. The king remained seated above the court, but his attention sharpened. Everett did not look surprised that his son had arrived beside another woman. He showed no anger over the dying ceremonial flame, only impatience. Mason, Eloan whispered. At last, he faced her. For a moment, she saw the man from the river, the one who had laughed through a forgotten vow and held her as if tomorrow were already theirs. Look at me, she said softly. His eyes met hers. Remember why you're here. Mason's face broke. Then he looked away. I can't complete this bond. Silence struck harder than shouting could have. Eloan waited for another sentence. Illness. Threat. Some hidden disaster large enough to explain why the man who had chosen her in private now stood beyond the altar as though a few feet of white stone were impossible to cross. What? Mason swallowed. Briar Glen is changing. My responsibilities are changing. When my father steps down, I'll serve beside the next leadership council. There are expectations. There were expectations 3 nights ago. Mason's cheeks reddened. I believe things could be different. Different from what? He hesitated. Eloan no longer needed the answer, but she made herself wait for it. Mason's gaze flickered toward Everett. My future requires alliances, and I prevent them. That's not what I said. Then say what you mean. Vivian remained beneath the arch, composed in gleaming silver. The insignia above her heart caught the lantern light. Eloan looked back at Mason. You told me my rank didn't matter. His mouth tightened. Privately, perhaps it didn't. The words seemed to surprise even him. Eloan felt something inside her become terribly quiet. Privately, she had been enough beside the river. Enough behind closed doors. Enough wherever loving her asked nothing of his courage. Lydia made a low sound from the platform's edge, but Nora caught her arm. Eloan did not move. And here? She asked. Before them. Mason had no answer. Everett stepped forward. This spectacle has gone far enough. My son is protecting Briar Glen's future. By letting her dress for a bonding ceremony he had no intention of completing, Nora demanded. Elder Warren struck his staff against the stone. Order. Vivian approached with graceful restraint and stopped beside Mason. No one intended unnecessary pain, she said. Her sympathy was polished smooth, leaving Eloan nowhere to grasp it. Sometimes duty requires difficult choices. Eloan's attention settled on the crane insignia again. Not pinned hastily. Not chosen tonight. Prepared. A memory surfaced. Mason returning from a council meeting 3 weeks earlier with a strand of silver thread caught near his cuff. Crane's silver. He had kissed her cheek and complained of a long evening. She had never asked another question. How long? Eloan said. Mason went pale. Eloan, how long have you known? Across the court, Callum leaned forward. Rowan followed his gaze from Everett to the Crane family. Mason stepped nearer, but still did not enter his ceremonial place. For one aching second, Eloan wished he would lie well enough to give her one final memory untouched by cowardice. Instead, Mason reached for the black band around his wrist. Long enough. He removed it and placed it on the moonstone altar. Eloan stared at the band, then at the man who had once asked her to look at him if he forgot why he came. Now she understood. Mason had remembered. He had simply chosen something else. The black band rested between them like the remains of something Eloan had buried before realizing it was dead. No one reached for it. Mason stepped away first, and that small retreat hurt with startling precision. He had held her through the winter fever 2 years earlier. He had once walked 3 miles in rain because she mentioned Lydia needed willow bark. Now he could not endure standing within arm's reach of the consequences of his choice. Elder Warren's lined face tightened. Mason Whitlock, the vows have not been spoken. State clearly what you are declaring before these witnesses. Everett rose another step. There is no need to prolong this. There is every need, Warren replied. His amber robes stirred in the night air. Bonding law requires an accurate record. Mason looked toward his father again. Alowan saw it, the instinctive search for instruction. A bitter clarity settled through her. How many decisions had she mistaken for Mason's because Everett had been careful enough to remain outside the room? I withdraw, Mason said. Warren's fingers tightened around his staff. From the ceremony or from your recognized pairing? Silence followed. Vivian's pleasant expression sharpened at the edges. Both, Mason answered. A collective breath moved through the court. Alowan felt Nora start toward her, but she lifted one hand. Not because she did not need comfort. She needed it desperately. Yet if anyone touched her now, she feared her knees would surrender. Everett addressed the gathered families. My son's decision is lawful. The Whitlock line cannot be forced into an unsuitable bond simply because an Omega misunderstood private affection as permanent obligation. Lydia went rigid. Unsuitable. Alowan heard herself ask. Everett's gaze settled on her with practiced patience. This is not personal, Miss Hartley. Something almost broke inside her then, not from cruelty, but from the absurd gentleness of his tone, as though her future had been misplaced on a ledger. I wore my mother's bracelet tonight, she said. Her voice carried farther than expected. I stood here before my pack. Mason knew I would. She turned to him. You knew? Mason's throat moved. Yes. And you let me come anyway. He had no answer. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others watched with the bright attention people reserved for disasters that belonged to someone else. Vivian approached Mason and rested 2 fingers against his sleeve. The gesture was restrained, almost proper. That made it worse. Alowan studied them and remembered Mason canceling supper 3 weeks earlier because his father required him at a council meeting. She remembered seeing silver thread on his coat afterward. Crane silver. A detail dismissed because trust had seemed kinder than suspicion. Was she at those meetings? Alowan asked. Mason's face changed. Vivian answered for him. Political arrangements are not your concern. They became my concern when they were arranged while I prepared to bond with him. A whisper rippled outward. Callum's steel blue eyes shifted to Rowan. The commander gave the smallest nod. He had noticed it too. Not a failed romance. Coordination. Everett moved toward the platform. Enough. Elder Warren, declare the pairing dissolved and have Miss Hartley escorted away before distress makes her disruptive. Alowan's cheeks burned. Disruptive. She had not shouted, had not threatened anyone. Still, the story was already being rewritten around her. Warren hesitated. That hesitation gave Alowan courage. She reached for the pale ceremonial ribbon joining her wrist to the altar rail. Her silver hawthorn bracelet caught the lantern glow as she loosened the knot herself. Record the truth, she said. Warren stared at her. Child, please. Her hands shook, but the ribbon came free. I did not withdraw. I did not refuse the bond. I arrived at the appointed hour and remained until he placed his band on this altar. Mason looked wounded. For the first time, Alowan did not rush to soften what he felt. Right that I was abandoned. Everett's expression hardened. You will not use ceremonial records to shame my family. Your family made its choice publicly. Alowan laid the ribbon beside Mason's band. I am only asking the record not to lie for you. The court became utterly still. Then Everett's voice dropped. Remove her. 2 Briar Glen guards moved toward the moonstone altar. Nora protested. Lydia called Alowan's name. Elder Warren raised his staff, uncertain whether tradition gave him enough authority to stop an alpha on his own territory. Alowan remained where Mason had left her, pulse hammering. Dignity now the only thing she possessed that no one had yet managed to take. The first guard reached the platform, and from the royal gallery came the scrape of a chair against stone. Callum Blackwell rose. Callum did not raise his voice, yet both guards stopped before he spoke. The Alpha King descended from the royal gallery with the unhurried control of a man accustomed to entire rooms adjusting around his decisions. Rowan Pierce followed several paces behind, watchful and silent. Aloan could hear Callum's boots against the stone steps. One measured strike after another. The sound moved through the ceremonial court until even Everett Whitlock turned away from her. "Your Majesty," Everett said, recovering quickly. "This is an internal Briar Glen matter." Callum reached the courtyard floor. "You invited a representative of the crown to witness your bonding ceremonies. As a courtesy." No, Callum's steel blue eyes settled on him. "As part of a royal inspection." The distinction landed heavily. Everett's shoulders stiffened. Aloan remembered the rumors Lydia had mentioned weeks ago, complaints from Omegas whose inheritance claims vanished after rejected pairings, petitions that never seemed to leave Briar Glen territory. She had never imagined any of it could touch her. Until tonight. "The woman is distressed," Everett said. "I ordered her removed for her own welfare." Callum glanced toward Aloan. It was the first time his attention reached her without the distance of the gallery between them. She noticed the narrow scar through his right eyebrow, the severe line of his mouth, the unsettling stillness of someone who wasted neither motion nor judgment. She expected pity. There was none. Somehow, that steadied her. "Miss Hartley," he said, "did you ask to leave?" Every face turned toward her again. Aloan swallowed. "No, Your Majesty." "Did you threaten anyone?" "No." "Refuse Elder Shaw's authority?" "No." Callum looked back at Everett. "Then explain what danger required 2 guards." Everett's jaw tightened. "An alpha has a responsibility to preserve order. Order is not the absence of inconvenient testimony." A faint shift passed through the spectators. Mason stared at the floor. Vivian's hand had disappeared from his sleeve. Aloan watched Callum approach Elder Warren, who bowed deeply. "The ceremonial record," the king said. "Has the pairing been lawfully dissolved?" Warren hesitated. "Not yet, Your Majesty." Mason Whitlock declared withdrawal, "But Miss Hartley's statement must be entered before I close the rite." "Then the rite remains open." "Technically, yes." Everett stepped forward. "This is absurd. The intended male has withdrawn. There can be no bonding ceremony without a second participant." Something changed in Callum's expression. Not surprise. Decision. Rowan saw it and moved closer. "Callum," he said under his breath, abandoning royal formality for a single warning. The king did not answer. Instead, he turned toward the moonstone altar. Aloan's heartbeat stumbled. Months earlier, she had seen him once during a harvest inspection, only from across Briar Glen's infirmary yard, where she had been helping Lydia calm a frightened Omega child after an accident. Callum had paused near the gates. Their eyes had met for perhaps 3 seconds. Aloan remembered the strange warmth beneath her collarbone and how quickly the king had looked away. She had convinced herself the moment meant nothing. Now that same sensation returned. Deeper. Callum stepped onto the platform. Mason finally lifted his head. "Your Majesty?" Callum passed him. No threat. No accusation. He treated Mason with an indifference so complete it seemed to reduce every excuse to dust. Then the king stopped before the white stone. Before Mason's discarded black band. Before the pale ribbon Aloan had untied with her own trembling hands. The empty side of the altar waited beyond it. Aloan forgot the crowd. Callum looked at her, and for the first time that night, someone seemed to see neither a failed bond nor an embarrassed Omega. He saw a woman who had asked a room full of powerful people to tell the truth. "Elder Shaw," Callum said. Warren gripped his staff. "Your Majesty? You said the rite remains open." "Yes." Everett's face drained of color. Rowan closed his eyes briefly, as though a possibility he had feared was becoming real. Callum moved around the altar and stopped in the place Mason had abandoned. A shocked breath swept through the court. Aloan stared at him, unable to speak. He did not reach for her. He did not claim her. He simply stood there, broad shoulders squared beneath the moon, occupying the space that had become the symbol of her humiliation. Then his gaze shifted to Everett. "The ceremony will not end," the Alpha King said, "while the law is being twisted before me." And beneath Aloan's silver bracelet, something answered with a single pulse of heat. The pulse beneath Aloan's bracelet vanished so quickly she wondered if fear had invented it. Across the altar, Callum remained motionless, but his fingers had curled once against his palm. He had felt something too. Elder Warren looked from the king to the vacant ceremonial position beneath his boots. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "standing there carries meaning under the old rites." "I am aware." Everett pushed forward, then stepped down. Gasps broke across the court. No territorial alpha addressed the crown that way, but panic had stripped polish from Everett's voice. This woman was promised to my son. His withdrawal does not make her available for royal amusement. Eloan recoiled. Callum's eyes turned glacial. Choose your next words with care. I mean only that Briar Glen law cannot punish her for his cowardice. Mason's face tightened. I made a lawful choice. Callum finally acknowledged him. Then bear it without asking everyone here to pretend she made it for you. Mason fell silent. The words gave Eloan no pleasure. She looked at the man she had expected to grow old beside and felt grief where anger should have lived. That frightened her more. Anger might have preserved something between them. Grief understood there was nothing left to save. Elder Warren lowered his voice. The rite requires a second participant only if bonding is to continue. Otherwise, I can enter Miss Hartley's testimony and close the record. Callum looked at Eloan. And what happens to her afterward? Warren hesitated. Everett answered. Her recognized pairing is dissolved. She returns to unbonded Omega status. Inheritance standing? Callum asked. Another pause. Eloan's attention sharpened. What does my inheritance have to do with this? Everett's expression barely shifted. Nothing relevant tonight. Callum noticed the answer. So did Rowan. Interesting, the commander murmured. Eloan's mother's bracelet suddenly felt heavier around her wrist. The Hartley cottage, Lydia's healing rooms, the narrow meadow her mother had left in trust. Small things to Briar Glen's noble families, but they were hers. Callum's gaze returned to her. Miss Hartley, I can invoke royal protection. Confusion rippled through the witnesses. Celeste Blackwell, seated among the Crown's legal delegation, rose immediately. Her sharp green eyes fixed on her cousin. Specify the form. Callum understood the warning. Temporary sanctuary under an open ceremonial rite. Celeste considered it. Permitted, if offered without mating claim and accepted verbally before the ceremony keeper. Everett went pale. Eloan heard Mason whisper, No. She turned toward him. He looked more alarmed now than when she demanded the truth. That realization cut through her heartbreak. Why not? She asked. Mason said nothing. Callum did not look away from her. If you accept, no Briar Glen authority can alter your status, property, or testimony until the Crown completes its inspection. There it was. Not romance. Not rescue dressed as possession. Protection. Yet the offer came from the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories, standing where Mason had left her, while hundreds waited for Eloan to make another choice beneath their scrutiny. Her breath shortened. And what do you receive? She asked. A flicker of something almost tender crossed Callum's severe features. Nothing you do not freely give. The answer frightened her because she wanted to believe it. Callum, Rowan warned quietly. Once witnessed, the political meaning cannot be undone. I know. Every rival pack will call this a royal challenge to Briar Glen. I know. Callum's attention never left Eloan. The cost is mine to carry. Eloan thought of Mason promising that rank did not matter until loving her required courage. She looked at Callum, a king openly naming the consequences before asking for her answer. Her fingers moved to the hawthorn bracelet. Her mother's voice returned from years ago. Darkness reveals what daylight allows people to hide. Tonight had revealed enough. What must I do? Eloan asked. Elder Warren stepped nearer. Offer your hand. Nothing more. Callum extended his palm across the moonstone altar. He waited. Eloan stared at it, then at Mason, whose fear had finally become impossible to misunderstand. Whatever Briar Glen intended after tonight, royal sanctuary threatened it. She placed her hand in Callum's. Heat surged beneath her collarbone. The altar flashed silver. Someone screamed. Callum's grip tightened, not to possess her, but to keep her standing as ancient markings blazed across the white stone. And while the entire court stared at the impossible light, Eloan looked into the Alpha King's steel-blue eyes and saw the one thing that terrified her most. Recognition. Recognition disappeared from Callum's face behind the discipline of a king, but Eloan had already seen it. The silver markings dimmed beneath their joined hands until the moonstone altar became pale again. Callum released her at once. Too quickly, as if touching her had become dangerous. Clear the court, Celeste ordered. Everett objected, but Rowan signaled the royal guards, and the witnesses were guided toward the outer courtyard amid frightened whispers. Mason tried to approach. Eloan, please. She raised one hand. Not tonight. He stopped. For 2 years, she had rushed to soften every hurt expression on his face. This time, she walked away and let him keep it. Celeste led them into a council chamber behind the ceremonial court. Lydia and Nora remained just outside the door at Alohan's request. Callum entered last. The moment the latch closed, Alohan turned toward him. You knew? He held her gaze. I suspected. Since when? A pause. The harvest inspection. Alohan remembered the infirmary yard. A frightened Omega child had fallen from a supply cart and refused to let the healers near her. Alohan had knelt in the dirt until the girl's crying slowed. When she finally looked up, the Alpha King had been standing beyond the gate. 3 seconds. Steel blue eyes. Heat beneath her collarbone. Then Callum had walked away. Months, Alohan said. You felt this for months. Yes. And tonight you watched me wait. The words struck harder once spoken. Callum's jaw tightened. Yes. Why? Because you had chosen Mason. I had been promised to Mason. I believed the promise was your choice. Alohan laughed once, without humor. You could have warned me. With what? His control slipped. A feeling? A pull I could not prove? Should I have summoned an Omega pledge to another wolf and told her the Alpha King desired her? Alohan flinched at the word. Desired. Callum saw it. He stopped. Something changed in his expression. There, he said quietly. That is why. The anger left her before she wanted it to. Callum stepped backward, deliberately adding distance between them. Even now, I speak too strongly, and you have to wonder whether disagreeing with me is safe. I don't think you would hurt me. That is not the same as feeling free. Celeste lowered her eyes, allowing the silence to remain theirs. Alohan studied Callum. Then why did you step onto the altar? He looked away for the first time. Royal sanctuary could have been declared from the gallery, she continued. You didn't need to stand where Mason had been. No, so why? Callum's fingers closed once at his side. Because when I saw him leave you there, I stopped thinking like a king. Alohan's breath caught. What were you thinking like? His steel blue eyes returned to hers. A man who had spent months pretending he did not want to stand exactly where Mason refused to. The chamber seemed smaller. Alohan felt the dangerous pull of those words and hated how much she wanted to believe them. Callum did not let her. And that, he said, is precisely why I should have been more careful. She frowned. I don't understand. When I crossed that court, I knew whatever it was doing was wrong. But standing beside you was not only law. Part of that choice was mine. His voice lowered. For a moment, I let what I wanted move faster than the question of what you needed. Alohan remembered the altar. Callum extending his hand. Waiting. You asked. After Celeste forced me to define the protection clearly. Celeste lifted one eyebrow. Forced is dramatic. You interrupted a king in front of 300 witnesses. And yet you survived. A startled breath escaped Alohan. Almost a laugh. The sound felt unfamiliar after the night she had endured. Callum's expression softened, then became serious again. I will not ask you for a permanent bond. Because you regret standing there? No, his answer came instantly. Because you were betrayed less than an hour ago, and I refuse to become the hand you choose only because you're afraid of falling. Tears pressed behind Alohan's eyes. Mason had always seemed happiest when she needed him. Callum was willing to risk never being chosen so she could know whether she wanted him. A knock sounded. Rowan entered carrying a narrow leather ledger. Whatever warmth had entered the room vanished when he placed it before Celeste. We found this in the magistrate's records. Celeste opened the book. Her eyes moved down one page, then stopped. Alohan saw the hawthorn seal beside her name. What is that? Rowan looked at her. A transfer order for the Hartley property. My mother's meadow? And the healing grounds attached to it. Alohan stared at the signature beneath the seal. Everett Whitlock. Why would Mason's withdrawal affect my land? No one answered immediately. Callum's face hardened. Celeste checked the date again. It wasn't prepared after his withdrawal. Alohan's skin went cold. When? Celeste turned the ledger toward her. 11 days ago. Alohan remembered that evening with brutal clarity. Mason had eaten at Lydia's table. He had held Alohan at the garden gate and promised he was counting the hours until their bonding. The next morning, white roses had arrived with his note. Alohan looked at the date once more and understood why Mason had been terrified when Callum offered royal sanctuary. He had known enough to ask questions. He had simply chosen not to. 11 days. Aloan stared at the date until the number seemed to divide her life into two versions of the same future, what she had believed she was walking toward, and what others had already prepared behind her back. While she had been planning to give Mason her life, legal papers already existed to take part of that life from her. Who signed it? Callum asked. Rowan turned the ledger. Everett Whitlock. Gideon Crane. Celeste traced the notation beneath both names. The Hartley Meadow borders the Eastern Trade Road. It's 12 acres, Aloan said. Lydia grows medicine there. Briar Glen approved a northern market route last month, Rowan replied. Expanded access would make those 12 acres extremely valuable. Aloan looked at the hawthorn seal beside her name. Mason knew enough to ask questions. No one contradicted her. She left the chamber. Callum said her name once, then let her go. Aloan found Mason beneath the eastern arch, sitting alone with his black ceremonial band between his palms. He stood quickly. Aloan, did you know about the papers? Mason's face answered first. My father said stewardship would be temporary. Did you ask why my land needed a steward? He said the failed ceremony could complicate your legal standing. Failed ceremony. The phrase was so clean. Did you know they planned to call me unstable? Mason looked down. Aloan waited. I knew there would be a competency review. The last tenderness she had been protecting inside herself went still. You knew enough. I didn't know they signed the transfer early. You knew enough. Mason stepped toward her. I thought someone would review it fairly. Who? Your father. He stopped. Gideon Crane? Mason's silence deepened. You keep measuring your goodness by the harm you almost prevented, Aloan said. I loved you. His voice cracked. Aloan believed him. That was the tragedy. You loved me when love asked you to hold my hand beside a river. She touched her mother's bracelet. Then it asked you to ask one dangerous question, and you chose not to. Footsteps crossed the court. Everett entered with Gideon Crane and 4 Briar Glen enforcers. Vivian followed, her composure stripped thin. Callum, Rowan, and Celeste emerged from the council passage behind Aloan. This interrogation is over, Everett said. No, Callum replied. It has finally reached the right question. Celeste raised the ledger. Why was an inheritance transfer authorized before the ceremonial event meant to justify it? Gideon's face tightened. Everett's eyes settled on Aloan. Because she was never capable of protecting that land. Aloan felt the words find every old bruise inside her. Quiet wolf. Gentle Omega. Useful healer's niece. A woman people trusted with frightened children, but not decisions. What makes me incapable, she asked. Everett almost smiled. You yield. You comfort. You spend your life tending weaker wolves and mistake kindness for authority. Callum moved, but Aloan lifted her hand. He stopped. Everett continued. The Hartley women were always the same. Soft creatures guarding valuable ground they lacked the strength to control. Lydia appeared at the court entrance. Her face lost all color. Everett, she warned. Aloan turned. You knew something about the bracelet. Lydia's eyes filled. Your mother made me promise. Everett lunged toward Elder Warren's ceremonial table. His hand closed around Aloan's recorded statement. Celeste shouted. Everett dragged the parchment toward a ritual flame. Aloan ran. She caught the other end before the fire reached it. Release it, Everett commanded. Alpha dominance crashed through her bones. Her knees buckled. The world narrowed to pain and instinct screaming at her to obey. Everett pulled harder. You were born to yield. Aloan saw the frightened Omega child in the infirmary yard, clinging to her skirt while stronger wolves demanded she stop crying. She remembered Lydia working until her hands cracked because sick wolves still came after sunset. Nora standing beside her when friendship offered no social advantage. None of them had conquered anyone. They had stayed. Aloan tightened her grip. No, the moonstone altar ignited in silver. Light raced through ancient carvings and crossed the ceremonial court beneath Aloan's feet. Everett released the parchment as if burned. Beneath her collarbone, the crescent-shaped birthmark blazed. Lydia began to cry. Celeste stared at the symbols emerging around the altar's rim. I know this inscription. Her voice shook. She read the old words slowly. The stone answers not to the hand that rules, but to the one who stands between power and the powerless without seeking dominion. Aloan could not breathe. Celeste looked at her. The Hartleys weren't given this ground. They were its keepers. Everett backed away. Bloodline superstition. No, Lydia said. She stepped into the light. Her mother hid the records because your father had already begun taking land from Omega families. Aloan looked at her aunt. Why didn't she tell me? Lydia's tears slipped free. Because she wanted you to become kind before anyone taught you that kindness could make you powerful. The truth moved through Aloan with no triumph in it. The Moonstone had not answered because she had become stronger than Everett. It answered because dominance had ordered her to surrender someone else's version of the truth, and she had refused to abandon it. Royal guards entered the court. Witnesses gathered beyond the open doors. Callum stood close enough to protect her, yet said nothing for her. Celeste placed a fresh ceremonial record on the altar. The keeper's testimony carries standing before the crown, she said. But the choice remains yours. Aloan looked at Mason, at Everett, then at Callum. All her life, louder people had explained what her gentleness meant. Now an entire court waited for her voice. Aloan stepped into the silver light. Then record this, she said. Aloan laid the torn ceremonial record on the Moonstone altar. Silver light still moved faintly beneath the ancient carvings, but she no longer looked at it. She looked at Elder Warren. Record that I arrived intending to complete my bond, she said. Record that Mason Whitlock withdrew after an agreement had already been arranged between his family and the Cranes. And record that 11 days before tonight, papers were signed to take control of my mother's property after I was declared incapable of managing it. No one whispered now. Families who had watched her humiliation stood beneath the lanterns as royal guards waited beside Everett and Gideon Crane. Vivian remained near her father, the Silver Alliance crest still pinned above her heart. Everett strained against the guard holding him. She is an angry Omega seeking revenge. A few hours earlier, Aloan might have rushed to prove she was gentle, harmless, reasonable. Instead, she placed the damaged parchment beside the fresh record, then examined the signatures. Rowan brought forward the ledger. Celeste added the road expansion decree and correspondence recovered from Gideon's magistrate office. The evidence required no dramatic speech. Dates aligned. Seals matched. The eastern trade route crossed the Hartley boundary exactly where Everett and Gideon had planned to place the land under Alpha stewardship. Vivian's face changed as Celeste read one letter aloud. My father told me the Hartley claim would expire naturally. Gideon hissed her name. Vivian stepped away from him. You said Aloan would be embarrassed and sent to relatives outside Briar Glen. Vivian, you never said you would declare her incompetent. Her hand rose to the Crane insignia. She removed it and placed the crest beside the evidence. No apology followed. Aloan did not need a beautiful redemption from a woman who had helped stand beside Mason while she waited. But when Vivian chose the evidence table instead of her father's side, Aloan saw the first honest decision she had made all night. I need to testify, Mason said. Everett turned on him. You will remain silent. Mason's shoulders tightened. For one moment, Aloan saw the son who had spent years searching his father's face before making difficult choices. Then Mason faced Elder Warren. My father told me bonding Aloan would damage my succession prospects. Gideon offered Crane support if I withdrew and later bonded with Vivian. His voice roughened. I knew there were property stewardship papers. I knew Aloan could face a competency review after the ceremony. But you didn't know the transfer was already signed, Aloan said. No, she studied him. If the king had remained in his chair tonight, would you ever have told me? Mason opened his mouth. The court waited. His eyes filled with something Aloan once would have rushed to comfort. I don't know, he whispered. There it was. Not cruelty. Not innocence. The truth. Aloan nodded once. Thank you. Hope flickered across his face. Does that mean you can forgive me? Someday, perhaps. Mason's breath caught. But forgiveness is not the same as returning. She turned away before his sorrow could become another responsibility she carried for him. Celeste announced the Crown's immediate orders before dawn. Everett was suspended from Alpha authority pending formal judgment. Gideon's magistrate powers were revoked. Every Hartley transfer order was frozen, and all competency seizures approved under Briar Glen's local statute would be investigated. Mason surrendered his future beta appointment and agreed to identify the meetings he had attended. The consequences were not vengeance. They were simply the weight of choices finally left with the people who had made them. When the witnesses dispersed, Callum found Aloan beside the altar. The Hartley land remains yours, he said. Not because the moonstone answered you. Not because of me. It was never theirs to take. Aloan looked at their hands, separated by inches of white stone, and the royal protection bond. You may dissolve it at sunrise. His answer came without hesitation. Even after learning I'm your true mate? Something moved in his eyes. Especially then. Callum removed the king's signet from his right hand and placed it between them. Destiny is not another law I will use to tell you where to stand. Aloan stared at the ring. Mason had panicked when her freedom threatened his future. The most powerful man in the Northern Territories was offering her a clear road away from him. She did not take Callum's hand. Not yet. Aloan crossed the court to Lydia, and her aunt opened her arms. Nora joined them a heartbeat later, crying hard enough to laugh at herself. Over Lydia's shoulder, Aloan saw Callum turn away, giving her grief the privacy Mason had never given her humiliation. Your Majesty, she called. Callum stopped. Tomorrow night, Aloan said. Meet me here. His gaze moved to the moonstone altar. For what ceremony? Aloan touched her mother's hawthorn bracelet. For once, no one else knew the answer before she did. I haven't decided yet. Callum Blackwell had been waiting at the moonstone altar for 43 minutes when Aloan entered the ceremonial court. She stopped beneath the eastern arch. Once, this place had taught her the most painful sound in Briar Glen, the silence of hundreds waiting for a man who had promised to come. Tonight, there were no noble families whispering behind jeweled fans. No musicians held their bows above silent strings. Lydia stood beneath the hawthorn trees with Nora. Elder Warren waited near the ceremonial table, while Celeste and Rowan remained far enough from the altar to be witnesses rather than an audience. And Callum stood alone in the exact place Mason had abandoned. Waiting. Aloan had deliberately come after moonrise. She had needed to know. Callum had not sent a guard. He had not summoned Lydia or asked Nora to find her. He had not used the crown to turn her invitation into an obligation. He had simply remained where she asked him to be. Aloan crossed the courtyard. Callum watched her approach, and she noticed tension leave his shoulders only when she reached the first altar step. You waited, she said. You asked me to. The simplicity of his answer hurt somewhere gentle. Were you afraid I wouldn't come? Callum looked at her for a long moment. Yes. Aloan had expected reassurance. Perhaps the confidence of an alpha king's certain destiny would bring his mate back. Instead, he gave her the truth. Why didn't you send someone, she asked. Because then you might spend the rest of your life wondering whether you came freely. Her eyes burned. On the white stone between them rested two objects, Callum's royal signet and Mason's abandoned black band. Aloan had requested the second one herself. She picked it up. Mason had testified again that morning, and by nightfall, the royal investigation had widened beyond the Hartley land. Nothing could restore what he and Aloan had been. Accountability was not a road backward. I went to my mother's meadow today, Aloan said. Lydia showed me the records my mother hid. Celeste was right. The Hartley women were keepers long before Briar Glen had an alpha council. Callum listened without interrupting. Aloan touched the silver hawthorn bracelet at her wrist. For years, I thought she left me this because she wanted me to remember her. Perhaps she did. Yes. Aloan looked toward the moonstone. But I think she also wanted me to remember myself. Silence settled between them. Not the cruel silence of her first ceremony. This one gave her room. And the light when you touched me? Callum asked. Aloan's heartbeat changed. Celeste confirmed that was different. For the first time, the king's composure slipped. A true mate bond. Yes. Callum did not step toward her. Destiny had given him certainty, and still he waited. Aloan looked down at Mason's band. 3 nights before our ceremony, Mason told me that if he forgot his vow, I should look at him so he would remember why he was there. She turned the dark metal once in her fingers. At the altar, I looked. He remembered. He simply chose something else. Callum's jaw tightened, but he offered no insult against Mason. Aloan set the band at the outer edge of the moonstone. Finished. Then she lifted Callum's signet and placed it in his palm. Put this back on. Why? Because I don't need you to stop being a king before I can love the man. Callum went utterly still. Aloan crossed the final distance between them. You took his place when he left me here, she said. But you never demanded his place in my heart. You let me grieve. You let me question you. You even let me be late tonight. A faint smile touched his mouth. 43 minutes. Aloan almost laughed through her tears. Were you counting? Everyone. She offered him her hand. Then stopped counting. Callum looked at her palm as if it were the first gift no crown had purchased for him. Aloan, I am not choosing you because the moonstone lit beneath us. I'm not choosing you because you protected my land. And I'm not choosing you because Mason left. Her voice trembled, but the words did not. I'm choosing the man who was afraid I might not come and loved me enough to wait anyway. Callum took her hand. Silver radiance flowed through the altar, gentle as moonlight crossing still water. Elder Warren asked whether Aloan came freely. Yes. He asked whether Callum accepted her without claim over her inheritance, rank, voice, or will. Yes. Callum answered before the elder finished. Lydia laughed through tears. Nora covered her mouth. Rowan became deeply interested in the sky, while Celeste pretended not to notice. At dawn, Briar Glen would begin rewriting its bond laws. The Hartley Meadow would become protected healing ground, with Aloan as its keeper. Those were tomorrow's responsibilities. Tonight, Callum bent his forehead to hers beneath the fading moon. Once, silence had taught Aloan what it meant to wait for a man who would not come. Now it taught her something gentler, what it felt like to find a man willing to wait for her. The empty place at the altar had never measured her worth. It had only remained open until the right man understood that standing beside her was a privilege, and even a king had to wait to be chosen.